Welcome to In the Name of the Law with your host, Liisa Speaker from Speaker Law Firm. Joining her today is Sinas from Sinas Dramis Law Firm, along with Mary Chartier and Takura Nyamfukudza from Chartier Nyamfukudza PLC. Now let's discuss some remarkable stories and real cases.
Welcome to In the Name of the Law. In today's episode, we're going to talk about a compelling adoption case, forced labor in prisons, and how senior citizens become victims of fraud and scams.
In the name of criminal defense.
2 million people are incarcerated in state and federal prisons and jails across the United States, and the majority of those incarcerated people are working. Here to talk about the conditions that these individuals are forced to exist under are criminal defense litigators Mary Chartier and Takura Nyamfukudza of Chartier Nyamfukudza. Takura, the topic of forced labor is getting more attention lately. How is it that people can be treated this way?
Lisa, many people draw parallels to slavery, and the reason that this happens in prisons across the country is that the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which protects against slavery and forced labor, explicitly excludes people who have been confined because of a criminal conviction from its coverage. In fact, there's a Netflix documentary called 13th that goes into this topic in much more detail than we have time here for. In short, though, this practice dates back to the end of the Civil War and essentially resulted in the re-enslavement of Black people during the Jim Crow era.
So are people actually forced to work?
Oh, yes, they can be. Absolutely.
And what happens if they don't?
They lose privileges and they can actually go into solitary confinement, which we have covered in a prior episode about how detrimental that is for people's physical and mental health. But they can lose family privileges, the ability to communicate with their loved ones, all the privileges, and there certainly aren't many, but that people make that are allow people to function as human beings. I mean, people are literally locked in cages. And so the ability to communicate with a loved one is the bare minimum that should be offered. And that's taken away for some people if they choose not to work or they're unable to work.
So how widespread is this practice?
It's really widespread. I mean, it's throughout the country, throughout the federal system. The vast majority of people who are in prison are engaging in forced labor, whether they want to or not.
And do they get paid?
I mean, if you could call it that, right? I think that it usually averages between about 13 to 52 cents or something like that. I mean, it's minuscule.
Could you tell us a little bit about any formal job training or how safe these incarcerated workers feel?
Lisa, a recent survey conducted by the American Civil Liberties Union showed that 70% of the prisoners surveyed did not receive any formal job training, and that 64% felt concerned about their safety while working. They're under the complete control of their employers and are not afforded the same protections against labor exploitation and abuse that people on the outside enjoy. This is taking us back centuries.
So what are some of the ways that people who have never set foot in a prison benefit? How do we benefit from the work being done by these incarcerated workers?
So 8% of incarcerated workers are assigned to public works projects. They maintain cemeteries, school grounds, they do road work. So fix the damn roads, right? But who's doing that? They construct buildings and they fight fires in at least 14 states, fighting fires. I mean, just think of the rigorous training that some people go through to earn that credential. And although less than 1% of the workers are assigned to work for private companies, notably state-owned businesses employ 6.5% of incarcerated workers who produce the $2 billion in goods and services that Mary mentioned.
We've talked about R. Kelly and cases related to Larry Nassar in the past. How are these two names relevant to our discussion today?
So these names have been popping up in the media yet again, and they relate to this topic because both of those individuals have amassed a significant amount of money in the Bureau of Prisons, and that's the federal prison system. And so they have a lot. I mean, at one point, I think they each had roughly about $100,000 or more, and they're not making the payments that the government thinks they should be making as it relates to restitution, fines and costs, all those things that have been imposed upon them. Now, there is a mechanism for the government to go forward and seize money from both of those men. But rather than that, these very highly publicized cases caught the attention of politicians in Washington. And then now there's a proposal to take 75% of every federal prisoner's account and put it toward court costs, fines, restitution. So I think, Takura, you're the math guy. If my mom were to send me $50, what does that end up with?
Like $12.50.
Right. And because he knows I'm not that great at math, so he did it really quickly. But people use that money for basic hygiene products, to buy stamps so they can communicate with their loved ones, even the email system. So to email in the Michigan Department of Corrections, if you want to email your family member or your lawyer, you need to have an email stamp. It's not free. It's less than a regular postage stamp, but you still need to afford to buy that. And so without family members and friends putting a limited amount of money into an account, people can't buy like basic hygiene products. And for women, basic feminine hygiene products, they cannot purchase. And so this whole proposal is geared toward two high profile individuals, and they seek to really just, mess the system up for everybody else who's just barely trying to survive.
And are there practical benefits to making sure that the incarcerated people communicate with loved ones on the outside?
Yeah, of course, right? I mean, the same reason why we all want to communicate with our loved ones. I mean, that's one of the reasons why the COVID pandemic quarantine and the lockdown was so difficult. You couldn't see people, you couldn't hug people, you couldn't communicate face to face in person. Now imagine you're locked in a cage, and for some people, they're there for decades, if not for the rest of their life. Being able to communicate with family and friends is the bare minimum to allow people to just maintain their sanity. And when someone is being released, having that family support and the network support in the community is huge towards making sure that they enter back into society and don't reoffend. And so to try to cut off that communication by either seizing money from someone's account or forcing them to work, and if they don't work, they can't have family privileges, I mean, it's really quite horrific.
So what types of reforms are needed to address this problem?
So state and federal lawmakers, as well as prison authorities, must be pushed to eliminate these laws that punish incarcerated workers who are unable or unwilling to work. And those who choose to work should be guaranteed the same labor and wage protections as everyone else. So because the reality is that most people who go to jail or prison will ultimately get released, and incarcerated people deserve the same dignity and to be set up for success upon return to their respective neighborhoods.
I mean, people are engaging in hard work, and to pay them 13 cents an hour, and then for there to actually be proposals to take 75% of that is, I mean, it's patently unreasonable.
So just to play devil's advocate for a minute, you had a guest on in episode 4 who learned a skilled trade while he was in prison. He learned how to make leather goods. And when he was released from prison, he was able to use that skill to have a career. So talk about the skilled trades that some prisoners can learn in prison.
So what we're talking about here is forced labor. We're not talking about work training or educational training, which is absolutely essential. And the prisons should offer more of that to individuals, as we saw with Miracle McGowan, where he was released and then he had this amazing skill set that he had learned in prison. He wasn't forced, though, to take that class. It actually was a really difficult class to get into, and he had to show an interest and an aptitude. That's very different than forcing someone to work for 13 cents an hour and saying, if you don't, you're going to be locked alone in solitary confinement. Those are two really different things. The job training, vocational training, educational training, all of that is fantastic. Forced labor for pennies is not fantastic. I mean, unless you're benefiting from that forced labor, which some private companies and some public companies are, public institutions. And as you know, Lisa, we talk about these issues and more on our podcast called Constitutional Defenders. And if people are interested, we hope they listen.
In the Name of Criminal Defense is brought to you by Chartier Nyamfukudza, PLC. Go to WLAJ.com for more information on today's topics and to view other In the Name of the Law episodes. in the name of family law.
Today we're going to talk about direct placement adoptions, and more particularly, a problem that arises when there's a conflict between the Adoption Code and the Paternity Act. Now don't worry, we're not going to get too detailed for you, but I have some very special guests today. An attorney, Donna Medina. She does family divorce litigation and also has a special passion for adoption work and helping families find their adoption plan. And then I also have one of my former clients, Mike, and he and his wife have adopted 2 children through direct placement adoptions. So we're really happy to have both of you here today. Welcome.
Thank you.
So let's start by having Mike, you tell us the story. You had a child that came into your house. Tell us how that came about.
Yeah, so my wife and I, we registered with an agency back in 2015, and after about 4 or 5 months on a would-be wait list, we were contacted through that agency by a birth mother who was getting ready to give birth. And so we kind of went through a whole process of being selected and sort of a couple of interviews and met some of her extended family. And ultimately, she chose us to go forward with this private adoption.
And a lot of times these private adoptions nowadays are open adoptions. Is that what you would have been facing?
Yeah, so that was our goal for that, yes.
And so how did the baby come into your house? Well, how does that work?
Yeah, great question. So we were contacted the day he was born by the birth mother who gave birth at the hospital, and we were actually invited to come. And so very open, as you mentioned, and we wound up being with him and actually took him home from the hospital. So we got to kind of see his first meal, the doctor's tests, et cetera, and then ultimately took him home with us a day or 2 later.
And just to clarify for the audience, this is referring to unmarried parents, right?
Correct, yes. His biological parents were unmarried.
Right. So you ended up going to court, Donna, right?
Oh, yes.
To do the adoption.
Yes.
So how does that work?
So after the placement, the direct placement that Michael explained, the adoptive parents filed the petition for adoption. And the mother of the child has to name what we call the putative father, which is not a legal father, but mom names the father. Father is then notified. He's given a hearing date. We have to notify him in person. Sometimes it's hard. And then after that, there's a hearing scheduled, and dad shows up and is usually asked, not an appropriate question, but do you contest this adoption? Which is not the question that's supposed to be asked under the law. But if dad says yes, then we go to what we call a contested hearing. So the next step would be in front of the judge, and it's usually about a month later. And what happens is if dad shows up and says, again, that he's interested in stopping the adoption or becoming a custodial parent, then the contested process starts.
Right. And so then he has to put on evidence to show, why, he should be involved with the child's life and why it's in the best interest of the child for his rights not to be terminated, right? So I want to fast forward a little bit because we have a lot to talk about. Mm-hmm. So what happened after all the evidence was put on by both sides, the biological mother side and the putative father side? The judge makes a decision to deny the adoption. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So usually in these cases, what happens is the judge just makes a ruling from the bench. Everybody knows what it's going to be. If the putative father has a long history of, criminal convictions, if he's not employed, there's all kinds of things that come up. In this case, this is a 40-year-old man, so there was a lot. And after all that came in, judge says, I'm not going to make a decision from the bench. You're going to get it in writing. That was a little bit frightening because that usually doesn't happen. And when we got it, unfortunately, he decided not to terminate dad because he thought dad had turned a new leaf in his life. And he was, young enough that he could do that. And so he wasn't terminated.
Right. And so then the prospective adoptive parents, Michael and his wife, contacted me, and we ended up appealing, and we got a stay of the placement so the child was safe in their home the whole time that the appeal was pending. So this is where it gets really tricky, right, Donna? Mm-hmm. So then after the appeal is pending, mm-hmm. this guy who had not been involved with the mother's life at all, had not been helping her during the pregnancy, right, had no relationship with the child, he files a paternity action. So can you tell us what happened from there, Donna?
Correct. So the paternity action is actually assigned to another judge. And we had a couple of hearings, and Dad was there. Dad is a very angry person to begin with, and the judge became angry too, but at the wrong people. She was angry at me. She was angry about the whole situation because she just did not believe in adoption, and she believed that fathers had rights that go far beyond what this man's rights were because he wasn't a legal father at that time. So one of the first things that happened was she said, "What is a stay? Why is this child with the adoptive family? Why isn't this child with his father or mother?" And we had to go to court and get actually a definition of the word stay. And so she understood she couldn't move the child then.
Because another court had said the child stays where he is.
The adoption court, and you did that.
Right. And so, Michael, I mean, a lot's been going on in your family during this period of time. So first you get this decision from the adoption court that you're appealing, and then you go into the paternity case, right? And this judge is like questioning why this child's even in your house, even though you have an order that says he can be. What's going on in your mind and your heart, like when you're dealing with all of this?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So it was confusing, to say the least. My wife and I were not lawyers, so we didn't understand adoption code, let alone Michigan case law. So our trouble was that, boy, we were chosen, we showed up, we were committed, we wanted to make sure that we followed through with what we were asked to do, to be this child's parents. And it just seemed like around every turn that was just not what the case was. So again, not being experts in the law like you two, we were just in sort of denial. We were fearful. We were jaded. We were upset, and ultimately, going through that paternity case as well as third-party interveners, because we didn't technically have standing. But through that, it made it really difficult to get updates and to understand. Gosh, this judge just doesn't understand what the code is and what the law really was.
So we are approaching a very crucial day in the paternity case, and by then your son is 18 months old. So can you just really quickly tell us what happened the day that the court ordered you to bring him to court?
Yeah, so I'll never forget it. So it was a Friday. We received notification through your office, I believe. No, yours. Mm-hmm. And it was a bench decision, so a sua sponte decision, that we were mandated to bring the child in Monday morning at 8 o'clock with diapers, a car seat, and all other personal effects. And we were terrified. We thought, holy smokes, we're giving our son back, who we're the only family he's ever known. And it was devastating.
So we're really getting close to running out of time, and I want to make sure we tell the rest of the story, Donna. They did hand over the child. Yes. We did an emergency appeal.
Correct.
The Court of Appeals, thank God, agreed with us. And so Michael was able to get the child back after 1 week of him being in 2 different homes. And we didn't get to go into the details of what the judge ordered when she handed over the baby that had never met these people.
Right. So the parents, both of the parents, had to be supervised at all times. So the judge knew that because we had done an investigation, and she didn't want to get in trouble that way, but she still made it very clear that Michael was out. He was only there to hand over the baby. He's out of the case. These are the parents. And guess what, parents? You're going to have your son for the first time this Christmas. Congratulations. Yeah. And then from there, we had to hand
without being equipped at all to have a child in their house. And
Zero.
she recognized that much. So fast forward again, we're finally in the Michigan Supreme Court arguing this very significant case now about why the adoption court was wrong. Donna, can you tell us what happened there?
Yes, it was a very long process. But we had the appeals from the Court of Appeals. We also had appeals going in the Supreme Court after that, and we were just waiting. And very, very frightening. The baby was with Michael and his wife, so that wasn't a problem, but it's just the emotional upheaval because you never know what day it's going to happen. Lisa did her oral argument. We sat and waited. And then Lisa told us she thought when she would know when the decision was coming, and sure enough, she was right, and she won. Michael won.
And the trial. I mean, what the Supreme Court held is really significant because they said the adoption court was wrong.
Right.
Go finalize this adoption.
Yes.
Like it's not in the best interest of the child, and there was a whole bunch of reasons for that, but we won't get into that today. Yeah. I'm sorry, we could have talked for another 30 minutes for sure. Donna and Michael, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In the Name of Family Law is brought to you by Speaker Law Firm. In the Name of Personal Injury Law.
No one wants to think about being in a car crash, and it would be really terrifying if it happens, but it's better to be prepared and know what to expect. So today we have personal injury attorney Steve Sinas with the Sinas Dramis Law Firm, and he's brought with him a guest who has a lot of experience with car crashes. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks for having me, Lisa, and I'm very thankful for my guest here appearing, my friend and local police officer Steve Whelan. And Steve is coming on the show today because he has his own personal experience with car accidents. He's investigated hundreds of car accidents, and so he knows a lot about what it's like to be in a car accident, and we want viewers to get a better idea of that in the event that they or their family members are ever in one. So, Steve, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And let's start. So, if you are in a high-impact crash, what kind of sensory experience are you going to have in terms of the sights, the sounds, the smells, the fears?
First of all, it's completely overwhelming. The noise, the everything is just completely overwhelming. And if airbags go off in the car, sometimes you can smell almost a burning smell, and that adds another element of fear. In reality, that's just usually the airbag.
So what should a person do immediately at the scene when there's been a serious car crash?
So the first thing is to assess the injuries in the car, you or your loved ones, and see kind of the status of where everyone's at, how everyone's doing immediately. Then also you want to call 911. You want to notify people as quickly as possible that you need help.
What will the 911 dispatcher ask when you call in?
One of the first things they'll ask is the injuries, because that will dictate the priority of the police and fire response. And then after that, you're going to want to know where you're at, okay? Because cell phones, they don't always know where you're at. So it's really good to give as much cross-section of what roads are. Lastly, they're going to want to know what other cars are involved and kind of the big picture of the crash.
So when the police arrive at the scene, what should people expect in terms of what they're going to do at the scene, who they're going to talk to, how they're going to talk to you if you're the person in the accident? What should people expect about the police coming to the scene?
So the first thing a police officer is going to, at least they should, come in and block off traffic to protect the scene, to protect all the people in the cars. We encourage people, if they're injured, to stay in the car, just because you don't know the amount of injury you have.
You're safer in the car?
Right, especially in a severe accident. So then the police officers are going to block other cars from coming to that area. They're also then going to assess your injuries. They'll come up and ask the injury situation. Then lastly, they're going to be gathering information on your driver's license, your registration, your proof of insurance.
Will they be talking to witnesses and other people at the scene?
Right, especially in a more serious accident, independent witnesses are really, really important. So if you have the crash and somebody comes up and they say that they saw it, encourage them to stay there.
So what if the vehicle is disabled? Are you, the person involved in the accident, supposed to call the wrecker, or the police help take care of that?
So it determines how big of a road situation is. If it's on a large road like Saginaw or Grand River, the police officer will assess if there needs to be tow trucks hired or not, and if there are, then they will usually order those up. It's not a situation where you'd call your own in a big road like that.
What about the belongings in the car? Should you take those with you, or will you have a chance to get them at a later time?
Again, it depends on how big of an accident it is or how big of a crash it is. The larger the crash, the property is not the priority. The smaller the crash, you'll have time to be able to gather your things and make sure you arrange with your wrecker what you want to do with that stuff.
If you can't get your belongings at the scene, who should you call the next day or later on?
The police officer will give you a police report number. That'll have all the information from the other driver, from you, all the witnesses. It'll be the full investigation. In there, we'll list which records have the cars. And again, sometimes when people are taken off to the hospital, they don't know any of that stuff. And then that accident report will have complete information. Otherwise, you can call that record company to find out about your belongings.
So when it comes down to a situation where someone's seriously injured and there's a reason for an investigation to go on, what should people expect in terms of the police officers maybe reaching out to them? Maybe they're in the hospital. Maybe it's their loved one who's in the hospital and the police are calling and want to talk to them. Does that type of thing go on?
Depends on the severity, again, of the crash. If it's a very, very serious situation, there will be a full investigation. There'll be a full scene drawn of the area, a lot more interviews, a lot more investigation will go on from that. In a basic crash, you probably won't be called again, but that police report number is really critical for you to have to contact that police department so you can get your full report.
Are there times when the police actually go visit people in the hospital because they need to talk to them, need to get their statement about an accident?
Especially when you can't talk to the police officer at the scene and you're taken off to be evaluated at a hospital, then the police officer will do their best to go to the hospital and talk to you there.
So, Steve Sinas, what should people do to protect their legal rights following a crash? Should they be immediately contacting an attorney for help?
Well, Michigan's no-fault law makes some, for some various types of claims that can be complicated. So sometimes people think they can go it alone, but they should really think about how they need to protect their legal rights, what's happened to them in the crash. If there is another driver that caused the crash, they're going to have a claim against that at-fault driver. Potentially, they need to investigate. They have various claims they can bring to their own insurance company. So if it was my loved one, I would strongly advise them to get an attorney who knows what they're doing when it comes to this area of law. There's a need to take action because there are a lot of different timelines that you have to abide by. So it's important to think about representation, think about whether you need it, and then you need to think about who is the best attorney for you. And that takes a good amount of investigation in of itself. So these things can be overwhelming in the beginning, but if you comply with the investigation with the police officers, you get your own attorney and get your ducks in a row, so to speak, your rights are going to be better protected.
And that's how I met Steve.
Yes.
In my own sphere.
And I'm glad you recovered from your accident. I understand it was quite an ordeal, but having gone through that experience, I think it gives you a different perspective on the scene, doesn't it?
Very much so. Very thankful. My wife and I are doing very well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was an honor to represent Steve and his wife. And when we first took in their case, we thought that they weren't going to have as many troubles with their insurance claims, and they actually did. So it goes to show that you need to really protect your rights, and it was an honor to help Steve and his wife, and thankfully we were able to resolve their claims. So,
thank you to both Steves.
In the Name of Personal Injury Law is brought to you by the Sinas Dramis Law Firm.
Thank you for watching In the Name of the Law. See you next week.
Thank you for joining us today for In the Name of the Law. Please go to WLAJ.com for more information on today's topics, and please join us next week for another informative show.